Dead America, the Second Month, The Portland Conflict Part 5. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 41. Zion and Calvin finished tying Avery to a chair, seating him beside Martin and Blake, who were also tied up. Calvin knelt down beside Blake, using a towel from the back to tape down his leg wound, causing him some pain. He let out a sad whimper as his captor applied pressure.
"Oh, be a big boy," Calvin taunted. "It don't hurt that bad."
Blake just grimaced as he taped it down. Calvin unlatched the man's belt, ripping it free of his jeans and using it as a tourniquet just above the injury.
"Can't have you bleeding out now, can we?" Calvin drawled. "Well, at least until Jinx gets what he wants from you."
Zion glanced over at the corporal in question, who was pacing across the floor, slowly moving back and forth with his head down, focused on the battle scene laid out before him. He looked over every bullet casing, every drop of blood, rage in his eyes.
"You'd better go check on him,"
Calvin said quietly, inclining his head. Zion nodded. "Yeah, that's a good call," he agreed. He walked over, stopping in front of Jinx, who kept pacing around the larger man as if he weren't even there. Zion pursed his lips, glancing back at Calvin with a helpless stare. All his friend could do was shrug. Zion shook his head and turned, talking to the soldier's back. "Yo, Jinx, baby, you good?" he asked gently. "Getting me a little worried here." The corporal continued to pace, letting out a little noise in the affirmative, but kept going. This concerned Zion even more, and he finally grabbed the soldier's arm, stopping him and turning him around. "I need you to focus, brother," Zion hissed. "We got a situation and I need you at your best. Not this catatonic bullshit." Jinx stared up into his friend's eyes, giving him a discreet wink.
"I'm good. Just part of my interrogation technique," he whispered. "Now shake me and try to snap me out of it."
It dawned on Zion what he was doing, so he took him by the shoulders. "Come on, man! Get your shit together!" he barked, giving the corporal a shake. Jinx wriggled free before continuing to pace back and forth. Calvin finished securing the prisoners to their chairs, lashing down their legs as well.
"Okay, they're tied down,"
he declared, swiping his palms back and forth.
"What do we do now?"
Jinx stopped pacing, standing there for a moment. Without turning to face them, he instructed.
"Take 5. Get you something to eat."
He slowly turned, looking more evil than the devil himself.
"I'll take it from here."
Calvin glanced at Zion and received a nod, so they walked away from the prisoners, taking a seat near what was left of the buffet. Finally, Jinx broke from his position, walking slowly towards the bound men like a lion stalking its prey. He stood in front of Avery, who gaped up at him with wide eyes, his entire body quivering. Martin was a little more put together, sitting up tall and defiant. Jinx leaned, so he was eye level with him, not saying a word, just staring him down.
"Do your worst, soldier boy," Martin said with a sneer. "You don't scare me."
Jinx just continued to stare, only letting out a slight smirk at the bravado. He gave the slightest of nods as if to say, "We'll see," and it was clear by the clenching of Martin's jaw that he was a bit on edge. The corporal moved over to Blake, still in pain from the gunshot wound. Jinx leaned again, getting to eye level with the militia leader, staring deep into his soul. Blake seemed to be struggling to be like Martin, raising his chin in shaky defiance as he said,
"You're never getting anything out of us, you cock."
Jinx drove his thumb into the wound, and Blake let out a horrific scream of pain, thrashing against his bonds. Jinx dug a little deeper, not batting an eye.
"Please, stop,"
Avery cried over Blake's agonized screams. Jinx gave the wound one more push before letting up, staring Blake down even harder than before.
"Just wanted to make sure I had your attention," he said,
voice low and menacing. The corporal stood up and took a few steps back before pacing back and forth in front of the three captives. He did this for several seconds, making sure they were good and quiet and attentive, before speaking.
"A couple of years ago, I was over in the sandbox," he began.
No hint of humor in his tone, just deadly seriousness.
"We had been working with this small-town police force, trying to get them trained up so they could protect their own. Unbeknownst to us, one of the local warlords managed to sneak in a few of his men. One day when we were on a training mission, the warlord's men enacted their plan. They managed to fire off a few shots, hitting my interpreter. During the crossfire, they were able to take one of my troops hostage. We exchanged some gunfire and pushed them back into this small, empty house on the outskirts of town."
He continued his pacing, staring down each of the men as he passed them, their eyes fixed on him.
"Now, they were barking out what I can only assume was demands, but my interpreter was out of commission, so it fell on deaf ears," he continued. "This agitated them, so they made the mistake of visually threatening my man. They held him up to the window with a gun to his head." He raised a finger. "Now, I pride myself on a lot of things, and bringing my troops home in one piece is right at the top of the list."
He walked over to the table next to Zion and Calvin, grabbing some water and having some before walking back to his pacing, deliberately leaving room for one of the prisoners to say anything. They didn't.
"Now, some officers would have called for backup. Maybe even another translator to try and talk this out," Jinx said. "But seeing my man, my friend, with a gun to his head, sent me into overprotective mode. The next few moments were a blur, but it involved me firing an entire magazine into the cheaply made wall that the hostage taker was hiding behind. Bullets continued to fly as I ran towards the house, leaping through the door and killing everybody in that house that wasn't on my team. My man, for the record, was wounded, but alive, and still thanks to me this day."
He finally stopped walking, holding his finger up again and swerving to face the three head-on.
"Now, you may be wondering why I would tell you that story," he said, tone still like ice. "What that might have to do with this situation before us. And I'll concede that it's a very good question. One I would even ask myself if I were in your shoes. Well, the answer is simple."
He lowered his arms, broadening his shoulders.
"I want you to know what kind of man I am. Sure, you've already seen the friendly, jovial Jinx that will gladly blow up an enemy building to help save your friend. But you haven't met the serious, protective Jinx. The Jinx that is willing to risk injury, rank, and guarantee a mountain of after-action paperwork that would make a secretary cry." He spread his arms. "Well, congratulations. You've summoned that Jinx. Only this time, I don't give a damn about rank, and there's no paperwork to be had. I also don't have a command system keeping me in check, and I can guarantee my two friends over there are going to sit and enjoy the show, letting me do whatever I want to you in order to get the information I want." "Oh my God, we're so scared," Martin burst out, sarcasm evident in his tone. "What are you going to do, rough us up a little bit? You're military. You have standards."
Jinx didn't say a word, simply standing in front of him, leaning until they were eye to eye. After a few moments, Martin sneered.
"That's what I thought," he said. "All bark, no bite."
Jinx smiled, and in a flash drew his knife and jammed it into the man's leg just above the knee. Martin shrieked and thrashed, horror frozen on his face. Jinx's expression didn't falter, his smirk still creepily fixed as he stood up and stepped back, raising his voice so he could be heard over the screams.
"I'm going to ask this once, and only once, before I rip that knife out from your leg and start using it on more sensitive areas," he bellowed. "Where are my friends?"
Both Blake and Martin whimpered, but didn't answer. Avery looked panicked, looking at the other two desperately.
5,
Jinx said, holding up all of the fingers on his right hand.
4,
he continued, lowering a finger.
3,
the words came out in that same deathly serious tone from before.
2,
he was left with just his pointer.
1.
He didn't say 0, simply reaching forward and tearing the knife violently from Martin's leg, causing his wound more pain. As the man screamed, Jinx tossed the blade in the air, spinning and catching it in a slashing position. As he raised it, Avery opened his mouth. I'll talk, he cried. Jinx stopped an inch away from Martin's body, flipping the blade and wiping it clean on the man's shirt sleeve. He sheathed the knife and stepped over, standing in front of the quivering prisoner.
"Avery, Martin thanks you for speaking up," Jinx said. "You know, ever since I got here, you've been the only person who has treated me with any sort of respect. Like you were glad to have my help."
"I was," Avery babbled. "I am."
"So you know where they took my friends?"
the corporal asked, warning clear in his tone. Avery struggled for words beneath Jinx's terrifying stare, stammering but with nothing coherent coming out. Jinx grabbed his chair, Avery squeaking as Jinx jerked it away from the others until he was several yards away and spinning him around. The corporal leaned over so they were at eye level, with his back to Blake and Martin.
"Felt like you might be a little shy around those two," Jinx said. "I can see how they can be a little intimidating." He clapped his hands and rubbed his palms together. "Now, where were we? Oh yeah, you were about to tell me where they took my friends."
Avery choked out. "I'm not 100% sure."
"Well, how sure are you?" Jinx asked.
"Fairly sure," Avery replied shakily.
"Well, let's roll with that and see where it takes us," the corporal said. "So where are you fairly sure they've taken my friends?"
The prisoner took in a deep breath. "To the holding center in Bend," he said quietly. Before Jinx could ask a follow-up question, Blake thrashed in his chair.
"Avery, you shut your mouth right now or I'm gonna—"
He swallowed his words as Jinx drew his handgun with lightning speed and pointed it at his forehead. The corporal's calm and serious demeanor evaporated, and he yelled, "Say another word! Say another goddamned word! Please, I beg you! Say one more motherfucking thing!" He paused briefly. "You see this gun? It's heavy as hell, and you would be doing me a real solid if you gave me a reason to lighten the load by a few ounces by giving you a few bullets. So what's it going to be, Blake? You going to help me out, or are you going to shut the fuck up?"
The room went completely silent. Even Zion and Calvin stayed stock still, barely breathing. Blake, however, seemed the most uncomfortable. He didn't say a word, even went so far as to stop whimpering from his pain. Finally, after staring him down for several moments, Jinx holstered his gun and turned back to his prisoner, resuming his previous calm tone as if nothing had happened. "Apologies, Avery. You were saying something about the holding center in Bend," he asked. His prisoner swallowed hard, clearly unnerved by the flip-flopping.
"Yeah, it's where they keep the prisoners they want to interrogate," he stammered.
"Where is it?" Jinx asked.
"It's at the community college on the west side of town," Avery replied.
"Where in the community college?" the corporal pressed.
Avery shook his head vehemently. "I swear, I don't know," he insisted. "I've never been there. I just know that's where they take people."
Jinx leaned in, giving him a good hard look in the eyes. After several tense moments, he nodded, patting Avery on the cheek, making him flinch. "I believe you," the corporal said. "Now, you may not know where they are, but you know how to get into town. Isn't that right?"
Avery nodded like a bobblehead. "I know how I get in, but it won't work for you," he said.
"Why not?" Jinx asked, brow furrowing.
"It's going to be easier if you let me draw it," Avery said.
Jinx contemplated for a moment, debating on whether it was wise to free the prisoner. Sure, he had been on the up and up to that point, but it was still a risk. He glanced back at the other two, knowing they wouldn't hesitate to put a bullet in the back of his head if given the opportunity. Hell, they already had with Colin. "Zion, Calvin, see if you can find these two a nice, comfortable place to hang out," Jinx said. "Maybe the cooler."
"Gladly," Zion said,
and the two men got up, grabbing their whimpering prisoners by their chairs and dragging them roughly towards the back of the restaurant. Neither Blake nor Martin spoke, intelligently, not wanting to risk setting Jinx off again. As they left the room, Jinx turned back to Avery. "Before I turn you loose, there's something I want to know," he said.
"Anything,"
Avery babbled.
"Anything you want to know."
"Why are you being so forthcoming with me?" the corporal asked. "Everybody else in here acted like they wanted me dead from the moment they laid eyes on me. But you didn't. I just want to know why."
Avery took a deep, shuddering breath. "I grew up in Bend," he said slowly. "Spent my entire life there. Started a family, and almost lost that family when all this started. The militia, or whatever you want to call them, came in and stepped up. Saved a lot of lives. Turned Bend into a fortress. So when it came time to help the community out, I volunteered." He winced. "But, man, I'm an office manager. I pushed paper. Fired a gun maybe once every few years before all this. I'm not a die-hard believer in their movement. I'm not at war with the military like they are. So I saw no reason to treat you like a pariah, especially since you were helping us out."
Jinx nodded slowly. "Okay, I believe you," he said. "But I have one more question, and it's an important one. So think before you answer."
"Okay,"
Avery nodded, seeming a bit more at ease. Jinx's gaze darkened. "Did you know that they were going to kidnap my men?" he asked.
"No,"
the prisoner answered immediately. Jinx blinked at him, impressed with the speed of the answer. "Are you sure?" he asked.
"Of course," Avery replied. "I told you, I'm not one of their die-hard believers. They don't clue me into their plans. In their minds, I'm a civvy who is here to be ordered around, and that's all."
"Okay," Jinx replied, nodding. "Let's hear what you have to say about Bend." As he reached around to undo the restraints, the other two emerged from the freezer.
They're locked up tight and not going anywhere, Zion said.
Calvin paused. You setting him free? He asked warily.
Jinx nodded.
Yep, he's going to give us the lowdown on Bend, he said. What do you need?
They got some paper over there, Avery said, leading them over to the table with the hand-drawn maps. He moved them out of the way to get a clean sheet and a pen, and began to draw. He started with a big circle, drawing a line snaking through the middle of it with a secondary one just to the west. Okay, this is the city, he said, motioning as he spoke. Back before the apocalypse, it was home to nearly 100,000 people. The militia didn't want to surrender any of the buildings, so the perimeter really is that big. Calvin let out a low whistle, shaking his head.
Hell, it took everything we had just to secure a few neighborhoods, he muttered.
This main line in the center is the highway, cut straight through the heart of the city, Avery said.
And the other line to the west? Zion asked.
Avery tapped the map. Deschutes River, he replied. If I'm being honest, I think that's a big reason they put their main force here. Constant fresh water source. Most of the businesses are to the east of the river, with only a small collection towards the southern end.
What's to the west? Jinx asked. Besides the community college.
It's almost exclusively residential, Avery replied.
That's a lot more manageable than dense businesses filled with people, Zion mused.
You're getting way ahead of yourself, Avery said dryly. You gotta get in first.
He drew another circle around the perimeter.
This is the dead zone.
Oh, hell, do I even want to know? Calvin whined.
It didn't take long for the leader to realize this was a potential world-ending event, Avery said. So rather than simply execute the creatures, they decided to put them to work.
Zion sighed. Damn, he muttered.
More colorful language might be warranted, Avery assured him. Took a couple of weeks, but they constructed a makeshift fence around the outer wall they made, using a combination of chain-link fencing and barbed wire. Then dumped every zombie they could find into it, creating an undead army guarding the perimeter.
Don't they worry about them getting into the city? Calvin wondered.
Avery shook his head. The outer perimeter is sturdy, he said. Metal siding, cars, even used mobile homes in some places. It's not foolproof, but in areas where there are weak spots, they have guards. Heavily armed guards.
This just keeps getting better, Zion muttered. Where the hell did you even get the manpower for something like that? Calvin demanded, throwing up his hands.
15,000 soldiers. Another 15 to 20,000 civilians, Avery explained. Couple weeks working around the clock without having to worry about things like building permits or personal property rights. And a lot can get done.
Zion stared at him. Wait, you telling me there are 30 to 35,000 people in Bend? He asked.
Avery nodded slowly. Even that might be conservative, he admitted.
That son of a bitch was underselling me, Zion growled.
Most likely, Avery said.
Was he telling the truth about having armies? Zion asked.
Avery nodded. From what I understand, he admitted, yeah. And to answer your next question, no, I don't know what their strength is.
Doesn't matter right now, Jinx quipped. All that matters is getting my people out.
Getting our people out, Zion corrected.
The corporal glanced at him, giving him an appreciative nod, then turned back to the map. So, if you had to break in, how would you do it? He asked.
Avery let out a long sigh, looking at the map and shaking his head.
He stared for a long time, and then seemed to have an epiphany, circling an area to the northwest corner of the map, north of the community college.
You might have some luck here, he said. It's a golf course, so there isn't going to be much foot traffic like you'd find in the town or residential portions. If you're lucky, you might be able to sneak in undetected.
Okay. That will be our first stop, Jinx said. If we can't find a way in, we'll figure it out from there. So, we just going to rush in? Jinx asked slowly. through the dead zone, overrun a barricade, then storm a fortified position that's used to house political prisoners? Jinx shrugged. Pretty much, he quipped. Okay then, Zion said, cracking his knuckles. We'd better get moving.
Wait, what about me?
Avery asked, raising a hand. Jinx cocked a brow. I mean, we can give you a lift if you want, but I don't think they're going to let you in with us, he said dryly. Why don't you just hang out here for a while, Zion suggested. Surely they'll send some people up for you eventually. Avery shook his head vehemently.
And then what? He asked. Find Blake and Martin in the freezer? Get their story and execute me for treason?
The trio shared glances. They knew what needed to be done, but none of them were particularly pleased about it. Well, we can't do it here, Zion said. Calvin jerked a thumb over his shoulder. Take him out back? He asked. Jinx shook his head. No, well, yeah, we start with that, he said. Take him out back, pop him in the back of the head, nice and clean, load him up into one of the vehicles and drive them into town. Drop them off the overpass into town and let those things have a field day.
I think I'm going to be sick,
Avery moaned, curling his arms around his gut. You don't have to do anything, Jinx assured him. Just sit here and wait a day before going home to your family. He scrubbed a hand down his face.
What am I even going to say? He murmured.
Say you had some outsiders come in to help rescue Martin, and that things went badly, Jinx suggested. Tell them that you escaped after I shot Colin during the mission.
You think they'll believe that?
Avery asked, eyes wide. Jinx shrugged. If they hate the military as much as you say, they will, he said. Besides, it's not like anybody is going to be there to corroborate your story. Avery nodded jerkily.
Okay, I can do that, he said.
Do you have a quiet place in here? Jinx asked.
Yeah, the bathroom,
Avery replied. Go there, and count to 1,000 before coming out, Jinx instructed. You don't want to hear what's about to happen. Avery nodded and extended his hand to the corporal, and they shook.
I know I'm asking a lot of you, but just know that I appreciate it, he said.
Jinx nodded and inclined his head towards the bathroom. Once the man was gone, door secured behind him, Jinx let out a sigh, shaking his head. You good? Zion asked. Yeah, the corporal said with another sigh. It needs to be done, so let's get it done. The three men walked back to the freezer, opening it up and finding Blake frantically trying to break free of his bonds. Martin! 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 He moaned over and over. The trio stood in the doorway, watching the man's panic, his eyes slitted from the light now streaming in from the door. Once his eyes adjusted, he turned to his friend who lay still, having bled out from his wound and died.
No! Martin!
He screamed, agonized.
Why did you do that to him? Why didn't you stitch him up?
Jinx stepped inside the freezer. For what it's worth, it wouldn't have mattered, he said. Blake snarled at him, but his eyes flooded with realization as the words sank in, and he looked up into the corporal's eyes. Just tell me one thing, he hissed. Why, you worried I'm going to hunt you down? I mean, that is what I would do. But I just want to hear you say it. No, it's not like that, Jinx said, shaking his head. In fact, I like a good game of cat and mouse with a dash of revenge. No, it's a lot simpler than that. Well, what is it then? Blake snarled. Revenge? You just a cold-blooded soldier boy murderer? The corporal sighed. Between you and Avery, only one of you can go home again, he admitted. And I like him better. Blake thought it through for a moment, letting out a defeated horror laugh before lowering his head. Just make it quick, he said. Jinx gave him a nod and drew his handgun, firing one precise bullet into his brain. The impact sent his head flinging back, switching his lights out in an instant.
The trio stood there for a moment, staring at the mess they'd have to clean up. Jinx took a brief second to compose himself, then turned to the others.
"You all right there?"
Calvin asked slowly.
"They'd be alive if they had played nice,"
Jinx said firmly.
"I'll take that belief to my grave."
He walked out of the freezer, taking a moment to breathe. Calvin began to follow, but Zion put a hand on his arm. "Give him a minute," he suggested.
"I don't get it,"
Calvin said with a shrug.
"He was threatening and carving them up earlier. Why the change of heart?"
"Big difference between doing something to save those you care about and doing an execution," Zion said. Calvin took a breath, then nodded.
"You get the big one. I can handle the other one,"
he offered, rubbing his palms together.
"Let's drag them out."
Zion nodded, and they grabbed the backs of the chairs, pulling them from the freezer so they could be dropped off on the way to their destination in Bend. Chapter 2. The sun threatened to come up over the horizon, but it wasn't quite there yet. A convoy of SUVs drove down the highway, just a couple of miles outside of Bend. In the back 2 vehicles sat privates Davila, Stein, Birch, Jarvis, and Rollins. Davila and Stein sat in one vehicle, the other 3 riding in the one behind them. All were bound around the ankles, hands secured behind their backs, mouths gagged. Davila looked at Stein, who had a bullet wound in his shoulder and faded in and out of consciousness. The wound had been poorly dressed, just a dish rag tucked beneath the shirt. It wasn't really an attempt to stop the bleeding completely, but to try to keep the blood off of the interior of the vehicle. There were 2 men in the front seat, a driver and Jesse, who sat in the passenger seat with a handgun. He pulled out a walkie-talkie. "Base, come in," he said. "This is Base. Identification, please," someone replied through the speaker. "Jesse, R6245, he said. "Copy that," the dispatcher replied. "What's your status?" "Caught us 5 military interlopers," Jesse reported. "Just showed up on our doorstep in Redmond. Wondering where you want us to take 'em." "Stand by," the dispatcher said. Jesse glanced into the back seat. "If you're lucky, they'll have us take you to the town hall," he said, and Davila let out a frustrated grunt through his gag. "What's that?" Jesse taunted, cupping a hand around his ear as he chuckled to himself. "Oh, if you're unlucky, let's just say that if they tell me to take you to church, then you should be praying for a quick death." Davila's eyebrows knitted in concern, and he looked over at Stein, who was fading quickly. He let out another angry grunt to get Jesse's attention and inclined his head towards his wounded comrade. Yeah, don't worry," Jesse said, waving a hand flippantly. "We'll get him patched up. Although, if we take you to church, you may not want me to." Davila breathed heavily through his nose, trying to keep his heart rate steady. "Jesse, you are instructed to proceed to town hall for inspection and further instructions," the voice on the radio said. "Copy that," Jesse said, snapping his fingers as if he were disappointed. "We're 2 minutes out from the gate." "They will be expecting you," the dispatcher replied. Jesse lowered the radio and sighed, firing a smirk into the back seat. "Well, you can breathe easy for a moment, partner," he drawled. "Looks like some of the higher-ups want to get a good look at you." Davila didn't give a grunt this time, simply looking out the window. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, and he could get a decent view of the landscape. It was vast and a mixture of emptiness and trees. There was a bit of frost on the ground from the overnight low temperatures. A few moments of this went by when he finally noticed a barbed wire fence running away from the road, and alongside it, something that shocked him to his core. There were dozens, maybe even hundreds of ghouls stretching out as far as the eye could see.
They were milling about, roaming aimlessly across the land. But nobody in the front of the SUV seemed concerned. This went on for several moments, the zombie-infested area going on and on. Finally, they reached the city limits, and Davila leaned in towards the middle of the vehicle, looking out the front.
"Might as well get a good look," Jesse quipped. "This is the last time you're ever going to see this beautiful structure."
The front of the town was a fortress. There were 10-foot-high walls made from various metal that blocked the entirety of the highway, with a shorter 7 to 8 foot tall fence going to either side. The highway itself was blocked off by a car barricade reinforced with metal. Even so, Davila could see through the slight gaps at a small army of zombies. Chains ran from some of the metal to the guard towers above, and his brow furrowed with curiosity.
"Oh, the chains?"
Jesse asked, having been watching the man's expression carefully.
"That one was actually my idea. They pull up big sections of the barricade to release the mob behind them. Good luck on a frontal assault."
The driver in the lead vehicle let out a honk in a specific pattern. 2 short blasts, 1 long one, and another short one. With that, the gate began to open outwards, revealing a fortified area. There were 2 gun nests on either side of the highway, with heavy machine guns at them both. 3 heavily armed and riot gear protected men stood behind them, presumably to help protect in the case of a mob of ghouls coming through. The road past them was filled with storefronts and other buildings. There wasn't much in the way of civilians, but a hive of activity from armed individuals and a fleet of vehicles. As they drove, Davila continued to survey the area, finding some workshops making modifications to vehicles, adding in front attachments to plow through zombies, and guns mounted onto the backs of trucks. Heavy-duty guns, too, which caused him to shake his head in awe.
"Bet you're wondering where we got those beauties, aren't you?"
Jesse asked with a laugh.
"Turns out that some of our more wealthy members had quite the collection of toys for their compounds. Even before this, I'm pretty confident that some of our members could have taken over some smaller countries."
They continued to drive down the highway, getting into more densely populated areas that were just springing to life as the sun came up. There were a mixture of civilians and armed militia types doing a variety of tasks. Some mundane, like opening up a shop or tending to greenhouses, while others were a bit more serious, like training civilians and running them through military-type drills. Davila couldn't tell if they were just preparing to deal with the inevitable zombie problem, or if they were training for war. Either way, it was clear this group was large and very organized. He made mental notes, knowing that if he did get out of here in one piece, that it would be valuable to the higher-ups. The rest of the drive was more of the same, really showing the size of the community. While there were signs that some areas weren't really utilized due to lack of population, most of the places were just like they had been pre-apocalypse. Finally, they arrived at a large stone building near downtown. There were several armed guards outside of it, standing at attention and looking very focused. The 2 SUVs carrying the prisoners stopped outside of it, and Jesse hopped out.
"You hang tight now,"
he called back into the vehicle. Davila watched as Jesse greeted a tall man that looked to be in his late 30s, with a refined and groomed beard. By his posture, he looked like he could be ex-military.
"Welcome home, Jesse,"
the man said gruffly.
"Good to be back, Maxwell,"
Jesse said, and they shook hands.
"So, what you got for me today?"
Maxwell asked. Jesse motioned for him to come back to the vehicle, and the tall man looked inside the window. He nodded approvingly as he moved along, stopping next to Stein.
Doesn't look like they came quietly, he mused.
You know these military cowards, Jesse spat. Once one of them goes down, the rest of them clam up real quick.
So they just showed up, huh? Maxwell asked.
Jesse nodded. They came in from up north and dropped the names of 2 of our scouts, he explained. Carrie and Matthew.
Maxwell nodded, straightening up. I know them well, he said. Odd of them to send you military personnel, especially since they have orders to eliminate on sight.
Well, Jesse said slowly, wasn't just these 5 who showed up. There were 3 others, a couple of civilians, and who I'm pretty sure is this group's CO.
And where are they right now? Maxwell asked.
Jesse shook his head. They joined Blake and a couple others on a mission into Redmond, Jesse explained. One of our decoy attempts went sideways and Martin was trapped. Blake managed to convince them to help us get him out while we took out this trash.
Have you heard from them? Maxwell asked.
Jesse shook his head again. Not since they left the base, he said. We took the long way around town, so not even sure if they were successful.
Maxwell nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Well, I hope that you aren't tired, because I need you to go back and make sure Blake secured the other soldier.
And the civilians? Jesse asked.
See whose side they're on, Maxwell instructed. If they're open to joining forces with us and have something to offer, bring them down for a chat.
And if not? Jesse asked.
Send them to the next life, Maxwell replied.
Okay, Jesse said, as if this were the most casual thing in the world. We'll regroup after that and continue clearing Redmond.
I want an update on that in 24 hours, Maxwell said.
Jesse motioned to the vehicles behind him. What do you want me to do with them? He asked.
Take them to church, Maxwell said. See what kind of confessions they make.
Jesse grinned, an evil glint in his eye. Yes, sir, he drawled. Davila clenched his teeth around his gag. He didn't like the church part, remembering Jesse's warning earlier. All right, Jesse declared as he got back into the passenger seat. Let's take them to church. The driver nodded and started the vehicle. The drive out there has some nice scenic views, Jesse said to the soldiers as they pulled away from the hall. You should enjoy them, because they're the last beautiful sights you'll ever see. Davila swallowed hard, sitting back in his seat, looking helplessly out the window as they drove away from town and towards whatever church was. Chapter 3. Jinx, Zion, and Calvin hiked through rough terrain a few miles to the west of the highway. They didn't want to take any chances of being spotted by anybody from Bend. Jinx led the way, marching at a brisk pace, just as he had for the past few hours. Zion was holding up well, but Calvin was falling a little bit behind. Jinx, I know we gotta get there, buddy, he huffed. But can we slow up the pace for just a few minutes? The corporal was determined and focused, but paused when Calvin spoke up. He stopped dead in his tracks, not turning back towards the others, and Calvin swallowed hard. Or I can just suck it up, he stammered, voice a little higher than normal. Jinx paused, turning around to face him, speaking calmly. 5-minute break, then we're back at it, he said. Calvin sagged with relief. Thank you, he said. It's the least I can do, Jinx replied, crossing his arms. You're risking your life on what's surely a suicide mission to help me out. I can do my part and not run you right into the ground. Calvin paled. Wait, he stammered. Suicide mission? Zion chuckled. It's 3 of us versus an army, he drawled. If it's not a suicide mission, it's close. Don't forget about the zombie zone surrounding the city, Jinx added. Oh yeah, forgot about that,
Zion bantered back.
How could you forget something like that? The corporal egged him on. That's not your primary concern.
I'm more concerned with trained, heavily armed soldiers aiming at me, Zion quipped.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and head back, Calvin huffed, waving a hand over his shoulder. Y'all let me know how this turns out.
Zion and Jinx laughed, the former putting an arm around his friend. Don't worry, man. We ain't gonna let anything happen to you, he said.
I know, but damn, Calvin drawled. Can y'all cut it out on the doom and gloom chatter? I know we're up against it, but that don't do me no good.
Jinx shook his head slowly, smile fading.
Sorry, just the way I deal with this stuff, he said. Joking about death? Calvin asked with a sigh.
The corporal nodded.
In my experience, some of the most morbid people on this earth are emergency room doctors, he explained. Because they see, well, they saw, guess there aren't that many of them left. Anyway, they saw the worst that humanity had to offer. People knocking on death's door, shift after shift after shift, with several walking through it every single night. Only way they got through it was having a sense of humor darker than the blackest of black holes. So I borrowed a page from their book and started doing it myself. Helped me get through some dark times when I was in the sandbox.
Calvin nodded.
I gotcha, he said, catching his breath. Just, if we can keep it to a minimum, I'd appreciate it. I got stuff to look forward to back home.
Yeah, my boy here is in love, Zion said, clapping his friend on the back. Pretty girl, too, and smarter than the three of us put together.
No offense, Jinx drawled, but if that bar was any lower, it would be subterranean.
The trio shared a laugh, enjoying the moment of non-morbid levity.
Calvin, just follow my lead, and I'll get you home in one piece, Jinx finally said. I'm not going to put you in any position that I'm not confident I can get you out of. You have my word on that.
Calvin took a deep breath.
All right, man. I'll take you at your word, he said. You boys ready to keep moving? Jinx asked.
The others nodded, and the trio got moving. They came out into a clearing after hiking for a while, finding a hillside. Looking down, they could see the outer edges of Bend far in the distance, maybe a mile out. Jinx stopped, taking out a scope and peering through it. He looked on the horizon, finding the walls surrounding the town. They were tall, sheer metal with no clear way on how to get up them. He slowly scanned the tops, finding a guard tower about every quarter mile or so. He let out a sigh.
Well, that don't sound good, Calvin muttered. Guard towers every few hundred yards, Jinx reported. Gonna be a bitch to deal with one of them while not alerting the others. I can work that out, Calvin offered.
What about the dead zone? Zion asked.
Good point, Jinx said, and raised the scope again, scanning the area short of the fence, letting out another deep sigh. You really gotta stop doing that, Calvin moaned.
Jinx handed over the scope, and he looked through. There was a partially wooded area with dozens of zombies roaming in and out from cover. A barbed wire fence stood about halfway across the empty space, between the hill and the woods. Most of the zombies were in the woods, but there were several in the open space as well, with no real way to tell how many of them were in the general area. Calvin let out a sigh as well.
See what I mean? Jinx asked. How the hell are we getting through that? Calvin moaned.
Zion took the scope, checking things out, and he completed the trio of sighs. Jinx, this is your show. How do you want to play this? He asked, handing it back over to the corporal. Jinx studied the area some more, paying close attention to the fence, which wasn't a straight line. It moved as much as 20 yards in and out to go around some natural barriers, like trees. He focused his gaze onto the guard post near the center of the line, seeing one guard at the top of it, who was scanning the area and aiming his rifle at some zombies, but not firing.
"Found our man," Jinx said. "Calvin, how close do you need to be to get a kill shot?"
Calvin held his hand out for the scope and checked the measurements. He put his hand up to feel the strong wind direction.
"Closer than I normally would," he admitted.
Jinx cocked a brow.
"Thought you were a great shot," he asked. "I am, but you want a guaranteed kill shot," Calvin explained. "I'm too far out from here, and there's a lot of open space between here and there, which means we need to get me to the trees to have a clean shot from cover. Because as soon as I squeeze that trigger, his buddies are going to be all over me."
"Not necessarily," Jinx said. Calvin gaped at him.
"The hell you mean?" he asked.
"Our boy there is aiming his rifle at some of the zombies," the corporal explained. "My guess is he takes shots from time to time. So if you get him in one shot from up close, his buddies will write it off as him taking out a ghoul." "You're basing that belief on what exactly?" Zion asked dryly.
Jinx shrugged. "Positive thinking?" he asked. "I mean, it sounds plausible, doesn't it?" "You're risking my life on plausible?" Calvin muttered.
"Risking all of our lives on plausible," Jinx corrected brightly. "Comforting," Zion drawled.
"Look, this is our best shot in," Jinx said. "He's in a recessed position that can't be seen from another post. If you take him out, then Zion and I can get inside."
Zion's eyebrows rose.
"We can?" he asked.
"I figure you're strong enough to boost me up so I can get over," Jinx replied.
"There's got to be something there I can lower to get you up."
Zion nodded. "All right," he agreed.
"Then what am I going to do?" Calvin asked,
pointing to his own chest.
"We're going to get you into position in the woods, fend off whatever zombies we have so you can get the shot," Jinx said. "Once we're over the wall, you haul ass back to this position. If that guy has a radio on him, I'll throw it back to the woods. If not, I get the feeling that based on the reaction of the other guards, you'll be able to tell what we're up to." "You're going to blow shit up again, aren't you?" Calvin asked dryly.
Jinx's eyes blazed.
"I will burn their entire civilization to the ground in order to get my people back," he said.
"I like him," Calvin said, elbowing Zion. Jinx looked to his right. At the hillside leading down towards an open area with trees that would give some cover.
"We should be able to use that underbrush there for cover to get to the ground," he said. "We'll just have to haul ass over that open area and hope they aren't paying attention."
"What are the odds of that?" Zion asked dryly.
"My guess is that these guys have been at this for a long time, and they haven't seen anything but zombies," Jinx said. "They probably haven't cared about actually doing their jobs for weeks now."
Zion tilted his head back and forth. "Let's hope you're right," he quipped.
"No kidding," Jinx agreed. "Come on, let's move."
He led the trio along the top of the ridge, taking up position at the top behind some trees. He looked at the 3 gunner towers in the distance that he could see. The one to his left was reading a magazine, the center one was still aiming at the zombies nearby, and the one on the right seemed to be doing his job of sweeping the horizon, very deliberately from one side to the other. The corporal watched him carefully, counting about 30 seconds for each movement from one side to the other.
"What about the zombies in the open?"
Zion asked.
Jinx turned to him. "What do you mean?" he asked.
"We killing or what?" Zion clarified.
"Avoid until we're in the trees," the corporal explained. "If we take one out, the guards might notice."
"Avoid it is," Zion said, cracking his knuckles.
"We're going to have to move quick," Jinx said. "Wait on my mark." He continued to watch until the scanning guard was looking mostly in the other direction. "Go!" They slid down the hill, which was about 100 yards from the position to the bottom, at a mid-level angle. They moved quickly, slowing themselves down by grabbing onto small trees and bushes as they went. In his head, Jinx was counting, having a good idea of when they were going to be potentially visible. He was first to the bottom, where there were a couple of larger trees. He put his hand up, grabbing each of the other men as they reached him to stop them. "Wait!" Jinx hissed. He pulled out the scope, looking through it towards the concerning guard tower. The man still panned around the horizon. "You didn't see anything," Jinx murmured. "You didn't see anything." He continued to stare the guard down, but he didn't stop his movement. When he began to pan away, the corporal prepared. "Get ready," he warned. 3, 2, 1, go! The trio broke from cover, running as hard as they could. Jinx didn't bother counting this time, because he knew it was all or nothing. The terrain was barren, only broken up by the barbed wire fence that was quickly approaching. The trio got there, leaping over it like hurdlers. Calvin, however, wasn't as athletic as the other two, getting his foot caught up in the top wire. He busted ass, falling face first into the ground. Zion turned around and rushed back, grabbing him by the back of the shirt and yanking him forward until he was back to his feet. He drew his knife, but Jinx shook his head. Zion nodded, and they ran to the tree line. Jinx was about 15 yards ahead of them, preparing to engage a few zombies. The only thing Jinx could do was shove them backwards, not even hard enough to knock them over. He gave a few shoves as the other two caught up before they made a run for the woods. Finally, they made it, knives drawn and ready to go to work as a half-dozen ghouls came at them from the open area. As they waited, moaning echoed from behind them. Zion turned towards another dozen or so spread out over 25 or 30 yards through the trees. "I'll start working on them. You two handle those," he said. Jinx and Calvin nodded and waited for the creatures to come in from the open before striking. The half-dozen or so were easy for them to dispatch, as they came one by one, and both men shoved their victims against tree trunks, planting knives into skulls. Zion, on the other hand, had a battle on his hands. He had a knife in one hand and moved swiftly through the trees, which were fairly close, but not so close that he couldn't move through them. He approached the closest zombie, jamming his knife into its eye before stepping to the side and grabbing another creature by the throat. The younger-looking zombie was lightweight due to its young death age, and he had no trouble driving it back into a tree, the back of its head splitting open on a broken branch. Zion didn't waste any time after taking those two out, darting through the woods and going after the zombies that hadn't turned their attention to him, instead shambled towards Calvin and Jinx. He knocked one down, slamming it headfirst into a tree while going after two others, grabbing the shirt of one and shoving it into the other. They were pinned against a tree as he went to work on their heads with his knife, making short work of them before turning and jamming the blade into the fallen one's skull. He looked over to Jinx and Calvin, both of whom had finished with the open-area zombies and were now coming to help him clear the immediate area. They spread out, taking down ghoul after ghoul as quietly as they could. It took them a few minutes of ducking around trees and delivering headshots, but the danger was quite low now that all three of them were dealing with the issue. Finally, the immediate area was a graveyard, bodies strewn everywhere, none of them moving. Jinx looked up towards the city, the forest stretching on for a few hundred yards. They saw some zombies moving far in the distance, but they weren't attracted to the noise, opting to continue milling about where they were. "Let's start moving," Jinx said. "Calvin, start looking for a shooting position." The man in question looked up, finding that a lot of the trees were barren. Even so, there were hundreds of branches that crisscrossed, blocking any clear line of sight to the wall. "We're gonna have to get a whole lot closer," he said. The group worked their way carefully through the woods, treading lightly on the fallen branches. As careful as they were, they still attracted the attention of the occasional ghoul, which was easily taken care of. As they walked, the sun was high enough to fully illuminate the forest. They looked to either side as they moved, seeing creatures as far as they could see through the trees. Only a couple started coming their way, but they were off in the distance and having issues navigating the wooded area. When they made it within 50 yards of the tree line, the fence came into view up ahead. There was a 20-yard gap between the edge of the trees and the sunken-in part of the wall. Calvin looked up, studying the trees for a few moments, nodding to himself. "If we get any closer, one of you guys could use a handgun," he muttered. "I don't want to get any closer before going up, because I don't want to be a sitting duck." "You going to have enough clearance through the branches?" Zion asked. Calvin shrugged. "Probably," he replied. Zion and Jinx shared a look and a shrug of their own. "I've gone ahead on lesser odds," Zion said. "Let's get you up there," Jinx agreed. "Once you're set, you get your shot and take it when you're ready. Don't worry about us. We'll be moving as soon as we hear that shot go off." "Make sure I hit the fucker first," Calvin warned. "Just don't miss," Jinx replied. "If you do, then don't be afraid to shoot again, because there's going to be another shot going off soon after, even if it isn't from you." Calvin nodded and extended his hand for a fist bump with Zion. "You be safe, brother," he said. "You too," Zion said as they bumped. "We'll see you soon." "If we're not back at the SUV by sundown, you take off," Jinx instructed. "Get north of Redmond, 5 miles and pull off. If you don't see us by dawn, head home." "What about the military there?" Calvin asked. "Find Sergeant Dickerson and tell him what happened," Jinx replied. Calvin nodded. "Just be sure that you're there," he demanded. Zion extended his knee so that his companion could use it to boost himself up to the first tree branch. After that, he climbed up quickly, trying his best to do it quietly. This was difficult, as branches snapped with almost every step. He glanced down, a good 15 yards off of the ground at that point, watching as the duo below took out a couple of zombies that had wandered over. "Son of a bitch," he thought. "When I shoot, I'm going to have to get moving because those things are going to be on me." He shoved the thought out of his head, trying to focus on the task at hand. If he didn't nail this shot, the rest of the stuff was immaterial, because they would all be screwed. Finally, he got high enough, a little more than 20 yards off of the ground. He could see the guard through the branches, who was still distracted by looking down at the zombies through his rifle, pretending to shoot them. Calvin pulled out his rifle, resting his front arm on a large branch for some extra support. He looked through the scope, getting the man in his sights, but the wind blew enough that it was moving the branches in front of him. Most of them were small and unlikely to hit the bullet, but there were a few that were large enough to take it out completely. Calvin took a deep breath, steadying himself, watching the branches move back and forth in rhythm, dancing across his line of sight. He could feel the breeze starting to die down, and he readied himself to fire. Finally, he caught the moment he wanted, the branches moving out of the way. He sent his shot downrange, which miraculously missed the branches. The bullet found its target, hitting the man square in the chest and sending him flying back. Calvin didn't move, keeping his rifle trained on the guard tower, hoping that the guy was alone in his post, but not taking any chances. It only took a few seconds before he saw Jinx being boosted up. Calvin watched as Jinx got up there, clearing the area and making sure that the guard was dead before vanishing from sight.
A few moments later, he popped up, holding a metal pole that he extended down. He strained as he held it tightly for Zion to get up, grabbing onto the edge and helping him over. Zion went on sentry duty. Jinx looked down, picking up a walkie-talkie from the dead guard, holding it up for Calvin to see before throwing it as hard as he could towards the tree line. He looked straight at Calvin, giving him a thumbs up before vanishing behind the wall.
"All right, boys. You bring 'em home safe," Calvin murmured.
He looked down, seeing a lone zombie shambling around the base of the tree, completely unaware of the meal above.
"And I'll take care of myself."
He began climbing down the tree, stopping just above the zombie, who still didn't know he was there. He pulled out his knife, waiting for the creature to be in the right position before leaping. Calvin fell a couple of yards, managing to jam the knife into the top of the creature's skull while collapsing on top of it, both of them hitting the ground hard. He laid there for a moment, catching his breath, but quickly perked up when he heard footsteps and moans coming from nearby. Calvin scrambled to his feet, seeing a few zombies coming from his right before hearing more sounds behind him. He looked over his shoulder, seeing another half-dozen slowly coming his way. He didn't hesitate, running towards the walkie-talkie, knowing he needed it to keep tabs on the boys and what they were dealing with. He ran through the trees, not paying the creatures any attention as he went. Finally, he spotted the device on the ground, with a zombie standing over it, attracted by the noise it was making. Calvin ran up to it, hitting it at full speed, driving the knife into its skull and sending them both tumbling to the ground. He quickly got back to his feet, pulling his knife out and grabbing the walkie-talkie, putting it up to his ear.
"Damn it, Billy! You answer me right now!"
A voice came through, agitated.
"What have I told you about shooting? You know the boss don't like it."
Calvin's eyes widened, unsure of what to do.
"That's fine. You don't want to answer me now. You can answer me when we get relieved in 20.
The voice warned. Calvin's blood ran cold as the realization took over of what that meant. Relieved in 20? He thought frantically. Shit. He turned, finding the zombies that had been following him were getting closer. He struck one of them down before flanking them, making a run for the far edge of the woods. He knew he had a window that was about to open for him to get back to the ridge. But this mission was on a clock. A tight, tight clock. Chapter 4. The sun was over the horizon as the two SUVs drove through a sparsely populated residential area. The houses were far apart, everybody having nice, large yards. The houses were quite large and newer, signifying that this had once been a high-end neighborhood. Davila stared out the window, not wanting to look over at Stein, who was still on his last legs. He knew he couldn't do anything for his friend, and looking at him was only going to aggravate him more. He needed to focus. Finally, the SUV made the turn into a large complex. Davila saw a sign for the community college, and confusion knitted his brows. There were a couple dozen armed men moving about on the grounds, including a squad doing exercises in the parking lot. There were half a dozen large buildings, 3 and 4 stories each, 3 on each side, with one large structure at the far end that was 5 stories tall. It seemed to be the administration building and had numerous guards outside of it. Davila looked around, trying to get a lay of the land, trying to figure out a path to escape should the opportunity arise. As they drove, one of the militiamen waved the vehicles down. When Jesse's SUV came to a stop, the man leaned towards the window.
"What's your business here?"
he asked gruffly.
"Have orders to take 5 prisoners to church,"
Jesse replied. The soldier tensed, glancing into the back seat with a look that could almost be described as pity. He took special notice of Stein, focusing on his limp form.
Your wounded doesn't look too good there, he said slowly.
He'll be fine, Jesse said, waving a hand. Davila shifted in his seat, agitated beyond belief, yelling for help through his gag. The militiaman glanced up at him, then back at Stein.
If your orders are to keep that man alive, you better let me take him to the medic, he said.
Why do you care? Jesse growled.
I care because the last time one of you jackasses said a wounded man was okay, he didn't survive the night, the man snapped. Only it wasn't you who got ripped a new one by Maxwell for letting a man die on my watch.
He straightened his shoulders.
So you know what? I don't care if you have orders to keep that man alive or not. I'm taking him to the medic.
Jesse blinked at him in surprise.
Well, pardon the fuck out of me, soldier, he drawled. Fine, take him. He's all yours. Do whatever you gotta do to get him back on his feet. But I'm going to be back tomorrow morning to escort this man to church, even if I have to drag him across the grounds myself.
You do what you gotta do,
the man replied, and turned around, letting out a whistle to a few men and waving them over.
Get this man to the medic. Tell him to start working, and I'll be there when I'm finished up here.
He opened the back door of the SUV, and the men responded in the affirmative before grabbing Stein and carefully lifting him from his seat. Davila stared helplessly at his friend, but was glad that at least he had until morning to find out whatever the hell was going to happen to the squad.
You know where church is, the militiaman said. Take them to him.
Davila's brow furrowed again. Him? He thought. The door shut and the SUVs drove off, headed towards the administration building, but stopping at the 3-story structure just to the right of it.
Okay, this is your stop, Jesse said brightly. Time to go to church.
He got out of his seat, waving to the others in the vehicle behind them. Their captors cut their ankle ropes, and the 4 soldiers were forced out of the SUVs and led at gunpoint into the building. 2 guards manned the door, and Jesse paused in front of them.
Where's he at today?
He asked. 3rd floor, today, one of the guards replied. Jesse grimaced, shaking his head.
3rd floor's a bitch, he muttered,
then turned to Davila.
You really are going to wish he said any other floor. Well, I mean, you weren't going to have a great time regardless, but 3rd isn't what you want to hear.
He led the group inside the building. A couple of months ago, this had been a beacon of higher education. Thoughts and ideas exchanged freely, and the next generation learning valuable things that would carry them and their country into the future. Now, it was little more than a chamber of horrors. It was dimly lit, with only the occasional spaced-out camping lantern placed on the floor. Several of the rooms they'd passed were destroyed. Some looked like they'd been smashed in fits of rage, but others had desks pushed together in the center of the room, stained with blood. Faint wails came from behind closed doors that were chained shut. The soldiers were all silent, every one of them just taking in the sights. Each one desperately plotting a way out should a chance come up. Jesse led them to the stairwell, pulling open the door and motioning for them to go through, but stopped before they crossed the threshold. He pointed to one of his men and motioned for him to go up first.
3rd floor. Everybody at least 5 steps ahead of me, Jesse instructed. If anybody so much as hesitates, I'll shoot them in the back. So if you're thinking about trying to kick me down the stairs to get away, I would really think again. Now get moving.
The group begrudgingly marched up the stairs, which were in near total darkness except for a lantern on each landing. They made it to the 3rd floor, the man opening it up, holding a gun in his hand. The soldiers moved by him and into the next hallway, stopping to let Jesse catch up.
The scent assaulting them was horrific. Blood smeared on the walls in satanic-looking patterns, while others were just frantic swipes and handprints. The soldiers stood there, trying to make sense of it all.
"Welcome to church," Jesse said. "First room on your right, if you please."
They walked into the room, finding a dozen metal chairs that had been chained together in a semicircle, facing a hole in the wall on the other side of the room. The hole looked like a post-apocalyptic addition, looking like it had been beaten down out of anger at some point. The only thing preventing a glimpse into the next room was a shower curtain featuring a cartoon kitten smiling at them. Oddly enough, it was the only thing in the whole building that didn't appear to be covered in blood, guts, or grime.
"Okay, everybody take a seat, leaving a space between you," Jesse barked. "My associates will secure you, and again, I would advise you to not try anything stupid."
He waved his gun in the air as a reminder. The soldiers sat down one by one, being fastened to the chairs by their cuffed hands behind them. Davila sat on the far wall, with Birch, Jarvis, and Rollins going across the line of chairs, each with an empty seat between them. Once everyone was situated, Jesse turned to leave, but stopped at the last second.
"You know what? I know that Church hates it when he can't have a conversation with his guests,"
he said, and went down the line, removing everyone's gags.
"But just some free advice. Don't speak unless spoken to."
He took a step back to admire his handiwork.
"It's been fun,"
he said with a sigh.
"Hope you enjoy church, and I'll catch you in the next life."
He bowed with a flourish and left, shutting the door behind him. The soldiers immediately began struggling in their bonds to get free, but there was no chance of that happening. It was clear they were at the mercy of whatever was going to happen next.
"Yo, church!"
Jesse bellowed from the hallway.
"You have some new parishioners."
The group sat in tense silence as the stairwell door slammed behind Jesse and his men, the sound like a nail in a coffin.
"Davila, what the hell is going on?"
Rollins hissed.
"Yeah, where is Stein?"
Jarvis demanded.
"Stein was doing pretty bad, so they took him to a medic," Davila replied, "and I have no idea what's going on."
"What the hell is church?" Birch wondered.
"I don't think it's a what. I think it's a who," Davila murmured. "And judging from this building, I don't think it's someone we want to know."
Before they could continue their hushed conversation, music echoed from the hallway. They listened for a few moments to the upbeat 70s funk tune, complete with a horn section. Everybody looked around in confusion, unsure of what to make of it. Even though the music was quite loud, it wasn't enough to drown out the screams of someone coming from the far end. There weren't any pleas, no words, just outright terror, echoing throughout the hallway to the beat of the 70s funk. Each of the 4 soldiers shared pale looks, stomachs turning, butterflies inside of them having a mosh pit. None of them knew who or what church was, but they knew they were in serious trouble. Chapter 5. Jinx and Zion ran through a small wooded area about a half-mile away from the fence, taking a knee at the edge of the trees. They found themselves at a golf course, looking out over one of the fairways. They studied the area for a moment, trying to see if there was any movement, but there was none. "How much time you think we got?" Zion asked. Jinx shook his head.
"If we're lucky, an hour maybe," he replied. "Have to assume they have regular radio check-ins."
"And if we're unlucky?" Zion asked.
The corporal shrugged. "They already know something's wrong and are actively hunting us," he said. Guess we should get moving then, Zion said. Jinx continued studying the golf course, spotting a clubhouse far in the distance to their left. Let's start there, he said. Thought we were looking for the community college, Zion asked. We have a general direction, Jinx explained. Might be good to know exactly where we're going. Plus, I don't know about you, but I've had my fill of hiking today. Zion chuckled. Ain't that the truth, he said. At least we're not in a canoe anymore. Come on, let's hit it, Jinx said. The two of them came out from cover, running hard across the fairway to minimize their exposure. While they didn't see anybody, they didn't want to take any chances. It took a couple of minutes to get close to the clubhouse, stopping at a small shack housing golf carts. Jinx took the lead, looking out from behind cover towards the building. There were 2 sedans in the parking lot, with one guard having a smoke by the cars with his back to them. Jinx took out his knife, preparing to throw it as they moved up towards the building. They were walking on grass, so they kept their approach relatively silent. When they got within striking distance, the corporal threw his knife, hitting the man in the back of the throat. The impact was violent enough to send the man collapsing to the ground, gasping for air. Jinx pulled out his handgun, covering the front entrance of the building as he moved over to the guard. He quickly grabbed his handgun and extra ammunition, holding the man's assault rifle to Zion, who readied it. Both men took a knee by the cars, staying out of sight. Jinx popped his head up, looking towards the building. There were 5 men just on the inside, sitting at a table and having some coffee, shooting the breeze, completely unaware that their buddy was down. Okay, I got 5 grouped together at the table, Jinx whispered. We're going in through the side there to catch them by surprise. You cover that table and open fire if anybody pulls or tries to get up. What are you going to do? Zion asked. Cover the rest of the room and clear the back, the corporal replied. Don't want to get surprised ourselves. Zion nodded and checked the rifle, making sure it was ready to go. Jinx motioned for him to follow, and the 2 of them rushed up to the door, quietly sneaking in out of view from the others. They were in a small side room that was just beside the main area where the men were. Jinx looked out, studying the room for just a moment, scanning the back, looking for movement. When he looked over the table, he noticed one of the men was looking outside a little too hard, perhaps noticing his buddy wasn't there anymore. As soon as he turned and tapped one of the others on the shoulder, pointing to the window, the duo burst in. Zion immediately rushed up to the table, stopping about 10 yards away, close enough to wipe them all out, but far enough away they couldn't reach him. If you boys wouldn't mind staying seated, hands flat on the table, I would appreciate it, he drawled, hyper-focused on them, aiming downrange, his finger lightly tapping the trigger as if he were hoping they would give him a reason to use it. Jinx quickly moved to the back of the room, his handgun at the ready as he made it to the double swinging doors that led to the kitchen. He gave the door a forceful tap as if he were about to go through it, which prompted someone inside to fire off a round at head level. Jinx immediately got low, rushing inside the kitchen area as more shots rang out at standing head level. He quickly figured out the direction they were coming from. To his right, Jinx slid onto his side, aiming the gun up and firing several rounds into the gut of a militia member. The man dropped his gun and collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air and moaning in pain. Jinx quickly got to a crouched position, aiming his gun around the kitchen, finding it empty. He moved over and picked up the handgun, putting it in his back belt. Sorry, I know gunshots suck, Jinx said. Had one myself. If you're lucky, you'll survive. He looked around, grabbing a towel off of the counter and tossing it to the groaning man. I'd apply pressure. As the man held the towel to his wounds, a shot went off in the main dining room. Jinx quickly emerged, ready to start blasting,
but stood down as the 4 men at the table continued to keep their hands pressed firmly on the top. One man on the right lay on the ground in a heap, his blood having splattered the other men's faces. Zion stood there, brandishing the assault rifle, moving it along the line of the other 4. "Anybody else want to move?" he taunted. "Come on. I got plenty of bullets in this thing, enough to go around. Any takers?" The men all shook their heads, keeping their hands still. "That's what I thought," Zion said with a smirk. "You good, brother?" "Yeah, 1 wounded in the kitchen," Jinx replied. 50-50 he makes it. He put his hands on his hips, staring down their prisoners. "And the sooner you guys answer my questions, the sooner you can get back there to help him. Everybody good with that?" All 4 of them nodded, though some of them didn't bother to hide the rage in their eyes, staring daggers at him. "Good. Let's begin," Jinx said, clapping his hands together. "First question. Some prisoners were brought in today. Where were they taken?" The men looked around, everybody shrugging. Jinx pointed to the one on the far right side, the one who had the most blood splatter on his face from his fallen friend. "You're the first spokesperson," he said. "If you're lucky, my friend here won't retire you." Zion aimed at the man's head, and he nodded furiously, eyes widening. "We haven't heard of prisoners being brought in today," he insisted. "Are you sure?" Jinx asked. "Positive," the man said emphatically. "We're runners, man. Even if they were brought in, they wouldn't keep us in the loop because that's not our department." "A runner, huh?" Jinx asked, cocking his head. "What does that entail?" The man hesitated, looking at his buddies as if to ask permission to answer. Zion grunted. "If you want to be retired, just let me know," he warned. Okay, the man gushed, shaking his head. "We have outposts all over the region, so we run everything between them. Supplies, messages, sometimes even people." "How big of a region are you talking?" Jinx asked. "Hell if I know," the man admitted, "but it covers several states." Jinx pursed his lips. This was a much larger problem than he'd thought. But this wasn't the time to ponder it. "That's another problem for another day," he said. "Right now, I need to know where the community college is." "Community college?" the man asked, but his voice was too shrill all of a sudden, and it was clear he was playing dumb. Jinx smirked. "I hear that little tinge in your voice, like you're surprised we know about it," he said. "We're not as stupid as we look. Now, you want to tell us where it is?" Zion raised the rifle slightly, grinning. "Please say no," he begged. "I dare you." Okay, the man babbled. "Go out the main driveway here. Take a right. Follow that road for a few miles, and you'll see it down on the right." Jinx stared him down for a beat. "Okay. I'm going to believe you," he said. "Oh, just in case you're wondering, we are very careful when it comes to our movement. So if you're giving us directions that, for example, might lead us into a patrol or a trap, just know that we're crafty enough to avoid it." He held up a finger. "At which point, we'll be forced to give up our rescue mission and flee for our own safety. But not before stopping by here and firebombing the building. Which will be a problem for you, because you'll be locked in the freezer." He cocked a brow. "So, are those the directions you want to go with?" The man's face reddened to near purple, guilt on his face that he'd been caught. "Go left, not right, out of the driveway." One of the other men spoke up. 3 miles, give or take, and it'll be on the right." "Look out at Zion, a man of honor right there," Jinx said. As they sat there uncomfortably, all of their radios went off, a beeping sound like an alert signal. "That sounds important," Jinx said, reaching down and grabbing one of the radios. He put it onto the table and turned it up. Code red! A voice declared.
We have a breach in the northwest corner of the compound. Emergency patrols are activated. Sweeps of area in standard search pattern. Drone squad is ordered to the area. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill.
Jinx turned the volume down before pocketing the radio. Guess that's our cue to get moving, Zion quipped.
All right, boys, stand up one at a time so I can grab your sidearms there, Jinx instructed. If you try anything, I will shoot you in the dick.
Zion wrinkled his nose.
Damn, he said. Not all men fear death, Jinx said. Every man fears that.
The militia men nodded in agreement as they got up one by one, allowing Jinx to grab their handguns from them. He reached into one man's pockets and grabbed the keys to one of the cars outside.
Okay, let's double time it, Jinx instructed.
The duo shepherded the men into the freezer in the back. After closing the door, Jinx grabbed an ice pick on a nearby table and shoved it into the lock, making sure they couldn't get out.
This just got a lot more interesting, the corporal quipped.
You're driving, Zion replied. Jinx nodded, and the two of them rushed out of the building, hopping into one of the sedans, starting it up. Jinx hit the gas, peeling out of the parking spot and rushing towards the road, hoping that there would be enough time to get close to the community college before all hell broke loose. Chapter 6. The four soldiers sat uncomfortably for quite some time. Nobody was quite sure exactly how long, but it was enough time for several 70s funk songs to play and repeat a few times. The songs on repeat were bad enough, but the most concerning thing was that the screaming had long stopped. The group sat in silence, with only Rollins attempting to break his restraints. The other three had long given up on the fact that they were captured and weren't going to be able to leave unless someone allowed it. Finally, after a long stretch of grunting and groaning and straining from the private, Jarvis had enough.
Jesus, Rollins, give it a rest already,
she snapped.
He glared at her. At least I'm trying, he huffed.
Yeah, I tried too. We all did, she shot back.
But we're not superheroes. We're not going to break through handcuffs.
Rollins was agitated, but didn't say anything in response. He knew that Jarvis was right. He slumped down in his seat, defeated. As if on cue, the music in the hallway stopped. Unlike the previous times when it was a natural break between songs, this one had been interrupted in the middle. Everybody looked around at each other, wide-eyed and frightened about what was coming next. It didn't take long for them to get an answer. A lone set of footsteps sounded, coming closer and closer at a deliberate pace. Step, echo, step, echo. They didn't break pace, didn't slow down, only getting closer and louder with each one. The door to the room next to them opened and shut shortly thereafter. Then, silence. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. The soldiers shared some confused glances, unsure of what to make of it. Finally, after several tense, uneasy moments, more 70s funk music kicked up. But this time, it was extremely loud, being in the room next to them. A bright spotlight kicked on, shining on the cartoon cat on the shower curtain. It nearly washed out the image, but only for a moment as a large figure stepped in between the light and the curtain, creating a harrowing silhouette. The music started to pick up the pace, and the shadows started to move to the beat. Not quite dancing, but moving enough that it was clear they were moving in time to the song. As the song hit its crescendo, the figure threw open the curtain and emerged from the other room like a performer entering the stage flamboyantly. The man looked to be in his mid-40s, totally bald, but with a 5 o'clock shadow. He was imposingly tall, at least 6'3", and built like an aging pro wrestler. A bit heavy, but strong. His eyes were alight with something that could only be described as controlled crazy. Almost like he knew he wasn't quite right in the head, but enjoying the fact. A playful psychopath. Below that, he wore a modest pair of jeans and a white t-shirt covered in a rubber smock. His clothes and the smock dripped with blood and guts. He stood in the light, slowly raising his hands up as the song built back up to one more furious finish. As the song ended, he extended his hands out to either side, splaying his fingers wide and looking around expectantly, as if to say, "Where's my applause?" The soldiers stared at him with concerned curiosity as he stood there for several moments before finally putting his arms down. He took off the apron, walking over to a hook on the wall and hanging it up. He spoke in a fast but slightly disjointed manner.
"First and foremost, my apologies on keeping you waiting for so long," he said with a half curtsy. "My previous appointment ran a little long."
The soldiers just stared at him, everybody afraid to say anything.
"You're allowed to speak," he invited.
"No problem," Birch said hesitantly.
"Thank you. I appreciate the courtesy," the man said, putting a hand over his heart and bowing slightly in Birch's direction. "Now, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Michael Church, and you have entered my sanctuary."
He began a slow walk along the line, looking every soldier in the eyes as he passed them.
"I do have a few rules before the service can begin. Rule number 1. He held up a finger. "You do what I say when I say it. This is a simple one, but a very, very important one. Part of the reason my arrival was delayed was because my previous appointment couldn't follow that one rule. On the plus side, they don't have to worry about messing that one up ever again."
The soldiers stayed silent, not taking their eyes off of the clearly unhinged man.
"Rule number 2,
Church continued, holding up a second finger.
"I ask the questions, and you give the answers. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Well, it is. Let me assure you that I'm a simple man, so my questions will be simple. You answer what I ask, and you just might see the daylight again with every part of your body in the place God intended it to be in. Any questions so far?"
"You're a sick man," Davila croaked before he could stop himself. Church snapped his fingers and pointed at the private, eyes alight with glee.
"Not a question, but you know what?" he asked, wagging his finger. "I'm going to allow it."
He moved closer to Davila, leaning down so they were eye to eye, his hot breath hitting the soldier's face.
"What's your name?"
"Davila," the soldier replied, trying not to gag on the stench of fresh guts.
"Good to meet you, Davila," Church replied brightly. "Now, indulge me if you don't mind. Why do you think I'm sick?"
The soldier hesitated. "I mean," he trailed off.
"Remember rule number 1,
Church said in a sing-song voice.
"While I'd hate to have to start our relationship off on the wrong foot, it would be beneficial for your comrades in arms here to see that I don't bluff."
A terrifying grin spread across his face.
"So I'll ask one more time. Why do you think I'm sick?"
"We heard the screams from your prior appointment," Davila stammered. "I can only assume that what's left of them is on your apron hanging on the wall over there. That's sick, man."
"Doing my job makes me a sick man?"
Church asked, cocking his head. "Maybe not to a true believer," Davila charged on. "But to us normal folks, yeah, that makes you sick." Church stood up straight, barking out a laugh as he strolled along the line of chairs.
"So, you think I'm a true believer?" he asked. If you're willing to do that to another human being, you're either a true believer or a psychopath, Davila explained. And despite your theatrical entrance through the cartoon shower curtain, you don't sound like a psychopath. Church continued to laugh before doing a complete 180 and sobering completely, tone deadly serious. Davila, my friend, my buddy, tell me, he said. What's the point in living in a world without rules if you can't have some fun with it? You think I'm a true believer? Hell no. I'm not a true believer. He waved a hand around his head. At least, not in their cause. I'm not anti-government. Frankly, I'm not anti-anything. Only thing I'm a true believer in is doing what I want to do, when I want to do it. And you want to carve people up? Davila choked out. Church shook his head. While there are moments I do enjoy it, that's not what brings me joy, he admitted. It's more of a means to an end. You see, the people in this fine community discovered my talents when they were going through the jail records. Rather than put me to death or out in the fields, which frankly might as well be a death sentence, they made a deal with me. They'd give me my own space, provide me with whatever my heart's desire, and in exchange I would do the things that none of them have the stomach for. Torturing people, Davila said dryly. No, I don't torture people, Church said, gently, as if he were explaining it to a child. I ask them questions. If they don't tell me the correct answer, I motivate them. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Church strolled back and forth, stroking his chin and grinning, pleased with the answer to his question. If you believe that, then you are a psychopath, Davila declared. Church sighed, turning around abruptly and leaning down, eye to eye with the outspoken soldier once again. You want to know the only time I enjoy carving someone up? He asked, eyes wide with madness and tone threatening. Do you, Davila? He poked the soldier in the middle of his chest. I enjoy making people who want to take what's mine away from me suffer. Hell, I'll take that a step further. He stood up straight, spreading his arms. I enjoy it when the person reminds me of someone who tried or succeeded in taking something away from me back when the world ended. And, you know, the more I look at you, the more you remind me of this guy from my old neighborhood, Jimmy. I didn't like Jimmy very much, because he took my bike when I was 12 years old. So what do you say we go ahead and get you to my office for some questioning? No, Jarvis cried. Church glanced over at her, and Davila thrashed in his bonds. Shut up, he yelled. I got this. Church pressed a dirty, blood-caked finger against the soldier's lips, making a long shushing sound. Where are your manners? He chastised. There's a lady talking. He stepped over to Jarvis, much to Davila's dismay. And what might your name be? He asked. She jutted out her chin. I'm Private Jarvis, she said. I can work with that, Church said, clasping his hands behind his back and bouncing on the balls of his feet. So, Jarvis, did you have something you'd like to contribute to the conversation? Maybe share your opinion on my status as a psychopath? You want us to answer questions, she said firmly. I'm happy to do it. So ask away. He grinned. A lady that gets straight to the point, he purred. Boys, how have none of you snapped up this little filly yet? He leaned down, dragging his nose across her jaw until he reached her hair, taking an exaggerated deep breath. Jarvis gritted her teeth and stayed stock still as he groaned with a desperate edge to the noise. Oh, I don't have enough digits to count the months since I've been in the presence of such beauty. Church said, voice husky as he ran a finger down the side of Jarvis's face. He turned, smirking at Rollins, who was staring daggers at him. "Okay, pretty boy. I see you peacocking and giving me that look. I don't want you to worry at all. I don't discriminate when it comes to my sexual harassment. But you'll have to wait your turn, because even though you may see me as scum of the earth, I am still a gentleman." He turned his wide grin back to Jarvis. "So, ladies first." Though she tried to maintain a brave face, it was clear that Jarvis was concerned, her face a bit paler than before. "Don't worry. I'll keep it in my pants," Church assured her, patting the top of her head affectionately. "Unless you ask nicely, of course. I always had a soft spot for pretty girls, and never could turn down a reasonable request." He stood up straight. "Now, if I'm not mistaken, you asked me to ask you the questions instead of any of these boys. Is that correct?" "That's right," she replied, clearing her throat nervously. "Pretty girl and the biggest balls in the room," Church commended. "So, you'll get your wish." He moved behind the chair, releasing her cuffs and gently escorting her through the curtain. "Don't worry," he called over his shoulder. "I'll try not to be too long with her. I know you're all dying for your turn." He pulled the cartoon cat curtain closed behind him, moving it slowly, peeking out from behind it as it closed. The soldiers sat there, unsure of what to do next. Before they could speak, the loud music kicked up again, and the only thing on their mind was hoping that Jarvis's screams wouldn't follow. Chapter 7. Zion and Jinx ran up to the outskirts of the community college grounds, about a quarter-mile away from the backs of the buildings on the east side, parallel with the middle one. They took a knee by some plant growth for cover. They looked towards the facility, seeing a massive amount of movement. There were 30 or 40 militiamen running around, no longer doing drills but preparing to be mobilized. The duo sat there for several moments, watching as many truckloads of men rode off. "Well, that's good for us," Zion murmured. "Kind of," Jinx said. "It's less men to deal with," Zion said. "How's that not a good thing?" "Everybody else is going to be expecting us," the corporal explained. "Shit," Zion muttered. "This is a huge place," Jinx said slowly. "I don't even know where to begin." "Looks like there's 6 buildings in the main row, plus the one at the top of the road," Zion said. "Should we start there?" Jinx continued to stare out, trying to figure out the next move. Finally, he shook his head, pointing to the building to the far right of them, furthest away from the admin building at the top of the row. "Let's start there," he said. "Any particular reason?" Zion asked, "or just a gut feeling?" "Bit of a gut feeling, and if things go really wrong, it's close to the parking lot there," Jinx replied, "so we'll have some cover and potential transportation." "Good enough for me," Zion said. "Get in through one of those back windows?" "Let's get after it," the corporal agreed. The duo exchanged a fist bump before emerging from cover. They ran quickly across the way, not wanting to get spotted by the patrols that were gearing up to leave. When they got halfway across the open space between them and the building, a couple of truck engines roared to life. Jinx immediately hit the ground, Zion following. There were some short plants and grass spread around, which didn't provide full cover. However, it was enough to conceal them from eyes that weren't explicitly looking for them. The duo stayed there for several moments as the vehicles vanished in the distance. Jinx let out a relieved sigh as he motioned for Zion to continue to follow him. They got up to the building, looking in through a couple of the windows on the far left side of the building. There were 3 classrooms that were dark and empty, looking like they hadn't been used for much any time recently.
Jinx made it to the one on the corner of the building as Zion peeked around, looking up towards the road. He didn't see anything, so he gave the corporal a thumbs up to break the window. Jinx busted it in one strike, then reached in, unlatching the window and opening it up. He climbed inside, gun raised and aimed towards the door in case someone came looking from the noise. When nothing came, he let out a soft clicking noise to let Zion know it was okay to come inside. The two moved quietly across the classroom, guns trained on the door, not wanting to take any chances. Jinx reached it first, looking out through the small glass panel. The hallway was illuminated from the sunlight coming in through the window against the outer wall. He couldn't see any movement, so he slowly opened the door, peering out and looking down the long corridor, straining his ears. Nobody was there, and most of the classrooms were dimly lit by the sunlight coming in through the windows. Only a lone room at the far end of the hallway was lit, brightly with unnatural light. Jinx and Zion spread out, making sure they had the full hallway covered by their weapons, each one pausing at every door under the cross, inspecting it before moving on. They continued to inch down the row, getting close to the classroom door with the bright light, both on the same right side of the hallway. Jinx moved to look into the first one as Zion took position across the hallway, aiming his rifle at the door. Jinx peeked inside and found a trio of militiamen going through supplies and getting geared up. They were moving rapidly, but Jinx could see that none of them had weapons actually attached to them. He turned to Zion, motioning that he was going to bring them over. Zion nodded, readying his rifle just in case. Jinx gave the knob a niggle, pretending that it was locked before knocking at the door.
"It's open,"
one of the men called. Jinx jiggled the knob again, giving a more forceful knock on the door.
"Ugh, I got it,"
the man inside said. The corporal holstered his gun and grabbed his knife, waiting for the door to open. Finally, the man made it to the door, pulling it open and stepping forward.
"The damn door was open!"
Before the man could finish his annoyed rant, Jinx grabbed him by his bulletproof vest, yanking him out into the hallway. The man started to freak out a bit as Jinx shoved him into the wall. Before the militiaman could process what was happening, it was too late. Jinx's knife went straight into his throat, and he dragged it across.
"Yo, you all right?"
one of the other men asked, and they approached the door, guns in hand. Jinx motioned for Zion to back up a bit more so that he wasn't as easily visible from inside the doorway. As soon as a gun crossed the threshold, Jinx reached out and grabbed the arm, causing the man to squeeze the trigger, sending a bullet into the wall. Jinx yanked him out into the hallway, trying to replicate the same attack as on the first man. Only this time, the militia member was able to fight back. As those two struggled, the other man came out of the room, raising his handgun towards Jinx. Before he could get his aim, Zion fired, hitting the man in the chest with his rifle round. The impact was devastating, ripping right through the vest and dropping the man to the ground in a heap. He was still breathing and tried to raise his gun up, but Zion fired one more shot, hitting him in the head. Meanwhile, Jinx fought with the other militia member, who tried to raise his handgun to get off another shot. But the corporal managed to smack it to the side, causing the bullet to hit the wall across the way, just above Zion's head. Jinx slashed his knife towards the man's arm, hitting it, the pain forcing him to drop the handgun. The militia member went on the offensive, stepping forward with his good arm and swinging a haymaker, which Jinx blocked, but it was forceful enough to send him stumbling. Before Jinx could regain his footing, he looked up and saw the man rushing him. He braced for impact, but no attack reached him as Zion pounced, tackling the man and shoving him against the wall with enough force to push the air from his lungs. Zion didn't let up, delivering a few kidney punches, which dropped the man to the ground in a heap. The man tried to pull a knife, but Zion stomped on his arm, snapping the bone.
"I can keep going if you want to get cute again,"
he warned. The man shook his head, putting up his good hand in a surrendering position, eyes wide with pain. "You good?" Zion asked. Jinx gave him a half-hearted thumbs up before pulling himself off of the ground. He immediately got to work, moving over to the classroom across the hall and opening the door. He started dragging one of the bodies into it, trying to conceal the battle. He knew the blood would be visible, but he hoped it was dark enough that nobody would notice from a distance. "I got this," Jinx said. "Interrogate him." Zion nodded, reaching down and grabbing his prisoner's vest, yanking it and the man off of the ground, and pinning him against the wall. "We had friends brought here," he said, voice lethal. "Where are they?" The man grimaced from the pain of being jostled, taking in a sharp breath through his teeth. "You have until he gets your friend in that room there before I amplify your pain," Zion warned. "So I'd get talking if I was you." The man nodded jerkily.
"They brought a man in a little while ago," he choked out. "He was injured badly, so they took him to the medic."
"Great. Where's the medic?" Zion asked.
"Second floor, first room,"
the man said. "Is anybody up there?" Zion demanded.
"I don't know,"
the man seethed.
"Probably a medic."
Zion snarled. "You getting smart with me?" he asked. "That's a bold-ass move if you are." The man shook his head vehemently.
"I'm not, but I have no idea," he hissed. "We came in to get geared up to go hunting for you two."
"Is anybody waiting on you outside?" Jinx asked as he emerged from the classroom, swiping his hands together. The man shook his head.
"No, we're the last squad that was going to head out," he said.
"How many more people are here?" Zion asked.
"On campus, dozen or so," the man replied. "Permanent guards."
"Where are the other people they brought here?" Jinx asked, leaning against the wall.
"I don't know, man,"
their prisoner moaned.
"Maybe at church?"
Zion and Jinx stared at him in confusion, asking, "At church?" at the same time.
"The sanctuary," the man stammered. "Last building up on the right. Never been inside and never want to. That place scares me, and I spent 3 tours in the sandbox."
Jinx wrinkled his nose. "3 tours, huh?" he asked. "And you threw your lot in with this group?"
"What can I say?" the man asked with a stuttering shrug. "I wasn't a fan of cutting and running."
The duo exchanged a quick glance. "You're satisfied?" Zion asked.
"Yeah," Jinx replied, nodding. "You got restraints in there?" he asked the prisoner. The militiaman nodded, clearly hoping that cooperation would save his life, unlike his friends.
"Top shelf, on the right," he said. "There's some tape too, since I assume you want to shut me up."
"Guessing this ain't your first rodeo," Jinx said.
"Not even close," the man huffed.
The corporal entered the storeroom, looking around and grabbing the restraints. He came back out and secured the prisoner before taping his mouth shut. Zion started to push him towards the room with the 2 dead men, but Jinx stopped him.
"Next room up," he instructed.
"Does it matter?" Zion asked.
"Man didn't cut and run. I can respect that," Jinx said. "No sense in torturing him by putting him beside his dead friends."
Zion nodded and shoved him towards the next room.
"Just know this wasn't personal," he said, "but I'm sure that when you come for us, it will be. I'm not mad at it."
The man let out a grunt and a nod before willingly walking into the darkened room as Zion shut the door behind him. He approached Jinx, who was raiding the storeroom. There wasn't much there, only small arms, no rifles. He grabbed a canvas bag, throwing in as much ammo and enough handguns to arm his team, once he could locate them, that was.
"He's secure," Zion said. "Then let's go see if he was telling the truth about the medic upstairs," Jinx said.
Zion nodded and the 2 of them headed out of the room, guns at the ready. They paused at the main hallway, looking towards the front doors. They were halfway expecting a hit squad to be there, ready to strike. But, much to their relief, there wasn't one. They moved down the hallway towards the stairwell, which was halfway down. They quickly moved up to the 2nd floor, pausing at the door. They looked down the 2nd floor hallway, seeing mostly darkened rooms except for one, which was extremely bright. Jinx led them out, going up to the room. He looked inside and spotted Stein strapped down to a table, but nobody else was around. After several moments of not seeing anybody but Stein, he nodded to Zion that he was going in. As he pushed the door in and poked his head inside, the cold steel of a gun barrel pressed against his temple. The hammer on the gun clicked back, causing the corporal to freeze.
"You fucked around in the wrong medbay, asshole,"
somebody said.
"Before you pull that trigger, there's something you should know," Jinx said. "Oh yeah?" his attacker asked. "What's that?" "You should always keep tabs on your surroundings," Jinx quipped. The man glanced up just in time to see Zion standing there with a rifle pointed directly at his head. He was a couple of yards away, but close enough that it was almost impossible he'd miss. "How's it going there, Doc?" Zion asked. "It was going fine," the medic huffed. "But now it's turning into a double fistful of ibuprofen kind of day." "Been there," Jinx said, as casual as if discussing the weather. "Having one of those days ourselves. Now you mind putting that gun down?" "Slowly," Zion warned. "It's pressed against the side of my head. Quickly is just fine too," Jinx quipped. The medic lowered the gun slowly, relatching the hammer. He set it gently on the floor before raising his hands and backing up. Jinx stood, and Zion kept the gun on the medic as the corporal rushed over to the soldier on the bed. "Stein, buddy, you good?" he asked. The private struggled to speak, grimacing in pain. "Hey, Jinx, did you get the others?" he said hoarsely. "Not yet, but they're next," Jinx said. Zion motioned with the rifle for the medic to head towards the bed, and he walked over, hands still high. "What's wrong with him, Doc?" Jinx asked. "Not a doc, just a field medic," the man replied. "The patient here got dinged up pretty good. Took a round to the shoulder that didn't get proper attention for quite some time." "Dude's pretty good," Stein said, still struggling to speak. "Stitched me up nice." "Why is he talking so poorly?" Jinx demanded. "I don't exactly have a fully stocked medbay here," the medic replied. "They keep that stuff at the hospital because they don't want to waste the good stuff on prisoners." "That doesn't answer my question," Jinx said dryly. "I had to get creative in prepping him for surgery," the medic admitted, "and as a result, he's going to be groggy for a while." "How long's a while?" Zion asked. "Maybe another hour," the medic replied with a half shrug. "Hard to tell." "Can you fix it?" Jinx asked. The medic blinked at him in confusion. "Fix it?" "Doc, I need you to listen to me. We don't have time for him to be groggy," Jinx snapped. "Can you fix it?" The medic nodded. "Yeah, I guess I can give him something that will counteract the drugs," he admitted. "But he's going to be hating life if I do." "Good. He'll be in the same boat as the rest of us," Jinx said. "Do it." The medic nodded and went over to a nearby cabinet, pulling out a vial and a syringe. He prepped it, then paused before injection. "This is going to sting like a bitch, especially your wound," he said. "But you'll be alert. Do you consent?" "He does. Now do it," Jinx snapped. "I'm talking to my patient," the medic shot back, voice and eyes stern. Jinx sighed and nodded, motioning for Stein to speak. "Yeah, Doc," the private moaned. "Go for it." The medic injected the syringe into Stein. It took several moments for it to kick in, but they could almost see the grogginess leaving his face, being replaced by pain. "Holy hell, that sucks!" Stein hissed through gritted teeth. "Welcome back, bud," Jinx said, patting his friend's leg. Stein sat up, grunting in pain. He swung his legs around, facing the medic, who, even at gunpoint, gave him a quick once-over. "How's your shoulder feeling?" he asked. "Like it has a fucking bullet in it," Stein groaned. The medic picked up a metal dish beside the bed, which rattled at the movement. He held it up, showing the bloodied bullet to the soldier. "It's not in you anymore," he said. "Still feels like it," Stein muttered.
Jinx held up a pair of restraints, handing them over to the medic. "While we'd love to stay and chat, we really should be going," he said. "If you wouldn't mind attaching yourself to something solid?" The medic clapped one end of the restraint to his wrist and the other to the medical table, before hopping up onto it and taking a seat. "Okay, let's hit the sanctuary and get the hell out of Dodge," Zion said. "Oof," the medic huffed at his words. Zion cocked a brow at him. "Not a fan?" he asked as Stein got down from the bed. "If your people are there, I'd get there sooner rather than later," the medic warned. "Sit tight, Doc. I'm sure someone will be along shortly," Jinx said. The medic nodded and laid back, getting comfortable as the trio left. "Can you handle a gun?" the corporal asked. Stein nodded, motioning for a handgun with his good arm. He struggled to check it, but once he knew it was good to go, he gave Jinx a nod. "Just don't ask me to reload," he said. Jinx smirked and pulled out another handgun from the bag, tucking it into the private's belt. "More where that came from," he said. Stein let out a pained chuckle and shook his head. The trio quickly made their way down the stairs and back down the hallway towards the front of the building. "Let's head back the way we came," Jinx said. "Should hopefully be able to sneak our way up to the sanctuary." As they walked up the hallway, and up ahead, a couple of militiamen were opening the door. Stein was the first to spot them and quickly raised his handgun, opening fire. He sent several rounds downrange, though they weren't the most accurate given he was firing with his offhand. They missed entirely, but were good enough to get the enemy troops to retreat out the door. Zion and Jinx rushed up to it, guns at the ready in case they tried to come back. Jinx got a little too close to the door, receiving returning fire. The shattering glass and flying bullets forced him to hit the deck and crawl back quickly to the side of the hallway. Bullets continued to fly into the building, with Jinx on the hallway side of the entranceway as they came in, Zion on the other side, with Stein taking cover inside a water fountain cubby area. "What the hell we doing, Jinx?" Zion barked. "I gotta get to my troops," the corporal said. "Then go get 'em," Zion urged. Jinx paused. "What about you and Stein?" he asked. "I'll take care of Stein and keep these fuckers occupied," Zion promised. Jinx began to shake his head, but Zion glared at him. "With Stein moving as slow as he is, we ain't all getting across the quad," he said firmly. "I can protect him in here while you get your men. Just know I will haunt your ass if you don't come back and get us on the way out." "Either we all go home or none of us do," Jinx said. They nodded at each other, and Jinx leapt to his feet, sprinting down the hallway. Zion looked out the front doors as a couple truckloads of militiamen screamed by, slamming on the brakes right after they cleared the front door. Zion whipped his rifle out, sending a few rounds back out the door to keep the attention on them. "Stein, when I start shooting, you get down to this hallway," Zion called. "There's a supply room right there. We're gonna need some firepower." The private nodded, and Zion popped out, unloading the rest of the magazine into the door. Stein ran out from behind cover, making it to the safety of the hallway before returning fire kicked back up. Meanwhile, Jinx ran as hard as he could to the end of the hallway. He knew they were on an extremely tight timetable, and there wasn't a second to lose. "Don't be too late for them," he thought frantically. "Please don't let it be too late for them." The end.